The morning Rosalie Bennett's uncle sold her to a stranger, he didn't even look up from his breakfast. He pushed the contract across the table, ink already dry, seal already stamped, and told her the matter was settled. Caleb Thornton of Silver Creek would have his bride by Friday, and the Bennett family debts would disappear by Monday. Her uncle shoveled eggs into his mouth while he said it. Didn't pause. Didn't apologize. Just wiped his chin with the back of his hand and told her to pack light because a rancher's wife didn't need much from her old life. Rosalie sat very still. She was 24 years old. Her father had been dead 11 weeks. And the man who was supposed to protect her had just sold her like a parcel of land nobody wanted. If that were you, sitting across that table, watching a man eat while he traded your future, what would you do? Before we go further, if stories like this move you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or forced into a corner you didn't choose, hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what Rosalie does with the life that was handed to her without her permission, that's the part nobody sees coming. The contract had been written in her Uncle Gerald's hand, which meant he'd been planning it before he told her. Rosalie noticed that detail immediately. The ink wasn't fresh, the creases in the paper were old, the signature line for Caleb Thornton was already filled in. Gerald had made this arrangement days ago, maybe longer, and had sat across from her at 3 dinners and 2 Sunday mornings without saying a word. That was somehow worse than the selling itself. "You'll leave Thursday," Gerald said, still not looking at her. "The stage comes through at dawn. Thornton's man will meet you in Silver Creek." "I haven't agreed to this," Rosalie said. Gerald finally looked up. He had the kind of face that had once been handsome and had curdled into something harder over the years. Deep-set eyes, a jaw that jutted forward when he was irritated. He looked at her the way men looked at weather they found inconvenient. "You don't need to agree," he said. "Your father left debts. I've been carrying them 11 weeks. This settles it." "My father left me," Rosalie said. "I'm not a debt." Her Aunt Patricia, who had been standing near the window pretending to rearrange dried flowers, made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath. A sound that meant don't push him. Rosalie had heard that sound her whole life, and she was so tired of it, she could have screamed. "Caleb Thornton is worth more than this entire county," Gerald said. "You'll have everything you need, a house, clothes, food, a name that means something in Montana." "And what does he get?" Rosalie asked. "A wife he didn't choose either?" Gerald pushed back from the table and stood up. He was a tall man, and he used his height the way small men used volume, as a way of ending conversations. "He gets a wife who won't cause trouble," Gerald said. "I suggest you be that wife." He left the room. Patricia followed. The door didn't quite close behind them, and Rosalie sat alone at the breakfast table with a contract she hadn't signed telling her where she'd be living in 4 days. She looked at the paper for a long time. Then she picked up Gerald's fork, set it carefully on his plate, and began planning what to bring. She had never been called beautiful. That was the plain truth of it, and Rosalie had made a kind of peace with the plain truth the way you make peace with weather. Not happily, but practically. She was broad-shouldered and heavy through the hips, and had a face that people called kind when they were being generous and plain when they weren't. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn jaw and eyes that people said were too direct for a woman. Her father had never said any of those things. Her father had called her the best set of eyes in the county and said she could read a sick animal from 40 yards and that she had more sense than any man he'd ever hired. He'd meant it as a compliment. She'd taken it as one. Thomas Bennett had run a small spread outside of Billings for 20 years. Not prosperous, not failed, somewhere in the stubborn middle that required constant work and occasional luck. He'd raised Rosalie mostly alone after her mother died when Rosalie was 9, and he'd raised her the way he'd have raised a son, teaching her to ride, to read weather, to assess livestock, to keep books, to negotiate with suppliers who tried to take advantage of people who looked like they needed to be taken advantage of. He died of a chest illness in March, 2 days after Rosalie turned 24. She had sat with him through both nights of the fever and had been holding his hand when it happened. She knew exactly when he was gone because his grip, which had been tight even in unconsciousness, released all at once. After the funeral, Gerald came. Gerald was her father's brother, which made him family in the technical sense without having made much effort in the personal one. He arrived with Patricia and a lawyer and a list of Thomas's debts, which were real. Thomas had borrowed against a bad year and hadn't lived to see the recovery. The debts were manageable, Rosalie had thought. She had a plan. She had explained the plan to Gerald, who had listened with the expression of a man hearing a child explain something he considered silly. "You can't run a ranch," he'd said. "I've been running it," she'd said. "You've been helping run it," he'd said. "There's a difference." She'd wanted to argue that the difference was mostly in his imagination, but the lawyer had started reading numbers, and the numbers had been large enough to make the argument feel smaller than it had a minute before. 3 weeks passed. Then a month. Then Gerald came back with the contract. She had not been consulted. She had not been warned. He had just sat down at breakfast with a settled expression and pushed a piece of paper across the table like he was passing the salt. Thursday came the way bad days always do. Ordinary at first, the sun coming up the same as any morning, the birds making the same noise, the air smelling like dust in early summer, and nothing in particular. Rosalie was up before dawn. She'd slept badly and knew she would, so she hadn't tried too hard. She had 2 bags. She'd packed practical things, her father's ledger books, which she had no intention of leaving behind, a wool coat, 3 dresses that could survive hard use, her mother's silver hairbrush, which was the one valuable object she owned, a dog-eared almanac she'd read so many times the spine had given up, and a knife her father had given her on her 16th birthday, which she carried in her boot because her father had said a woman alone should never be entirely unarmed. Patricia came to the door of her room while she was fastening the second bag. "You don't have to be difficult about this," Patricia said. She always framed things as Rosalie being difficult. Rosalie's having opinions was difficult. Rosalie's noticing things was difficult. Rosalie's existing at her actual size in a world that would have preferred her smaller was, apparently, the most difficult thing of all. "I'm not being difficult," Rosalie said. "I'm packing." "Gerald did what he had to do," Patricia said. "The Thornton name is a good name. You could have a real life." "I have a real life," Rosalie said. "You know what I mean." She did know what Patricia meant. Patricia meant a husband and a house and a position and the particular kind of security that came from belonging to a man of standing. Patricia had built her whole existence on that structure and could not imagine why anyone would find it insufficient. Rosalie picked up her bags. "Tell Gerald I said goodbye," she said, though she didn't mean it, and walked out without looking back. The stage to Silver Creek took most of the day. She sat with her bags wedged between her knees and a traveling salesman on one side who smelled of bay rum and kept trying to make conversation, and an elderly woman on the other side who slept with her head tipped back and her mouth slightly open and snored in a way that Rosalie found oddly comforting. She watched the country change through the window. Montana in late May was not entirely beautiful. It was too raw for that, too open, the sky too large and the ground too unfinished, like someone had started building something and wandered off. But there was a version of beauty in it if you were looking. Her father had taught her to look. She thought about what she knew of Caleb Thornton, which was not much. Gerald had given her a brief and largely financial account. Thornton Ranch, 12,000 acres, primarily cattle with some horse breeding, established 15 years prior, one of the largest privately held spreads in the county. Caleb Thornton, age 36, widower. No children. The widower part had given her pause, not for the reason Patricia would have assumed. She wasn't thinking about competing with a ghost, exactly. She was thinking about what kind of man a man became after losing someone. She'd watched her father after her mother died. She knew there were men who grew from grief and men who just grew closed. Gerald hadn't told her which kind Caleb Thornton was. Gerald probably hadn't thought to ask. The stage rolled into Silver Creek around 4 in the afternoon, raising dust, the driver calling out the name of the town like an announcement of something significant. Silver Creek was a real town, not large but established, with a main street long enough to have 2 saloons and a newspaper and a dry goods store with a painted sign. People stopped to look at the stage. People in small towns always did. Rosalie stepped down from the stage and immediately felt the looking. A woman she didn't know said something to the woman beside her that she couldn't hear. A man leaning against the post office rail looked her over, the way men looked over horses they were deciding not to buy. She had felt this kind of looking before, in other places, and had learned neither to shrink from it nor to pretend it wasn't happening. She just stood with her 2 bags and let them look. A ranch hand came forward from across the street. He was young, maybe 20, with a hat that was too large for his head and an expression of someone who had been given a task he found awkward. "Miss Bennett?" he said. "That's right," she said. "I'm Hector. I work for Mr. Thornton. He sent me to bring you out to the ranch." "Thank you, Hector," she said, and handed him the heavier of the 2 bags without asking if he wanted to carry it. He took it, looked faintly surprised, and led her to a wagon. The drive to Thornton Ranch took another 40 minutes, long enough for the sun to start its long fall toward the western ridgeline, and for the air to cool slightly. Hector drove without much conversation, which she appreciated. She didn't feel like making conversation. She felt like looking at what she was riding into. The land was good. She could see that even from the road. The grass was deep, and the fencing was consistent and well-maintained, and the cattle she could see in the distance were heavy and healthy-looking. Whoever managed this operation had some idea what they were doing. That was more than she'd hoped. The house came into view around a bend, larger than she'd imagined. 2 stories, with a wide porch across the front and a barn that was easily twice the size of anything her father had owned. There were outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a structure she thought was probably a tack room. The whole thing had the look of something that had been built to last and had been kept up carefully. She was revising her assessment of Caleb Thornton upward, which made her nervous, because higher expectations had more distance to fall. Hector pulled the wagon up in front of the house and climbed down to take her bags. Before she could step down herself, the front door opened. The man who came out onto the porch was not what she'd expected, and she wasn't sure what that said about her expectations. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that was just height, but the kind that had posture behind it, with dark hair that needed a cut and the sort of face that had probably been described as handsome once and had since acquired something more complicated. He wore working clothes, not dressed-up clothes, which told her he hadn't tried to make an impression. His expression was neutral in a way that took effort to maintain, and his eyes, even from the distance of the porch steps, were doing the careful thing, assessing, cataloging, deciding. He came down the porch steps and stopped about 6 feet away. "Miss Bennett," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Thornton," she said. Also not a question. They looked at each other across those 6 feet, and it occurred to Rosalie that this was the actual beginning of her life as she was now going to have to live it, and that it was strange how beginnings so rarely felt like anything at all. "I'll have Martha show you to your room," he said. "Dinner's at 7. "Thank you," she said. He turned and went back up the porch steps and into the house. Hector looked at her from behind the wagon with the expression of someone watching for a reaction. She didn't give him one. She picked up her smaller bag and followed Caleb Thornton inside. Martha Greer was the cook and housekeeper, and the first person at Thornton Ranch who spoke to Rosalie like a person. She was 60 or thereabouts, wide through the middle in a way that announced she had never considered apologizing for it, with white hair pinned back and a face that had laugh lines and squint lines in roughly equal measure. She showed Rosalie to a bedroom on the 2nd floor, large, clean, with a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that someone had made by hand. "You're not what they were expecting," Martha said, setting down a pitcher of water on the washstand. "I know," Rosalie said. "Half the town's been talking about the new bride since Gerald Bennett wrote Mr. Thornton 2 months ago." 2 months ago, Rosalie repeated. Gerald had had a 2-month head start on this plan. She filed that away. "Most of them think it won't last," Martha said. "Sorry to say it plain." "I'd rather you said it plain," Rosalie said. Martha looked at her for a moment. "Good," she said. "Then you and I will get along fine." She moved toward the door and paused. "Mr. Thornton's not a bad man. I want to be clear on that. He's a complicated one, but he's not bad." "What's the difference?" Rosalie asked. "A bad man knows what he's doing and doesn't care," Martha said. "A complicated one usually doesn't know what he's doing at all." She left. Rosalie stood in the middle of the room and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Boots somewhere below, a door, wind against the east-facing window. The room smelled like cedar and beeswax, and something faintly floral she couldn't identify. She set her bags down. She unpacked her father's ledger books first and set them on the desk, because that felt like claiming the space. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself, just for a moment, feel how tired she was. Not just the travel kind of tired, the other kind. Dinner was strained in the particular way of two people who had agreed to something they hadn't agreed to, served a meal by a woman who was watching them both carefully. The dining room was too large for two people and the table was too long, and Caleb sat at the far end with a glass of water and cut his food with the precision of a man who was paying attention to something that wasn't in the room. He asked her about the journey. She said it was fine. She asked about the ranch's current operations. He looked up. "Gerald told me you'd managed your father's spread," he said, and the way he said it was not quite a question. "For the last 3 years, largely," she said. "Before that, I helped." "What size operation?" "Small. Maybe 400 head at peak. 30 horses. 5 hired men." He set down his fork. "That's not small." "It's not large," she said. But it kept running. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. The way a man looks when the ground he thought he was standing on turns out to be slightly different than what he measured. He picked his fork back up and said, "I run 12,000 acres with 42 hired men. The operation is bigger than anything you've worked with." "I'm aware," she said. "I'm not comparing." "What are you doing then?" She met his eyes across the long table. "Introducing myself," she said. "Since no one really did." The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was at least honest. Caleb looked at her for a moment in the way a man looks at a statement he can't immediately find fault with, then nodded once and returned to his food. Martha, passing through with the bread basket, caught Rosalie's eye and did not quite smile. She couldn't sleep. The bed was more comfortable than anything she'd slept on in years, which was somehow part of the problem. It felt like sleeping in someone else's good luck. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch at night, which had its own sound. Cattle settling, horses moving, the distant bark of a dog, the wind coming across open country without anything to stop it. Around midnight she gave up and pulled on her coat over her nightgown and sat at the desk with her father's ledger books. She hadn't brought them out of sentimentality, though there was some of that. She'd brought them because they were the record of everything her father had learned about running land in this country, annotated in his cramped handwriting, which animals had thrived and which hadn't, which suppliers had been honest, which weather patterns had preceded which disasters, which decisions he'd made that he later marked with a small X to indicate he wouldn't make them again. The X's were her inheritance in a way. Every mistake already made, so she didn't have to make it. She spread the books on the desk and thought about the things she'd noticed on the ride in. The fencing was good. The cattle were good. But she'd seen 3 places where the drainage along the northern field looked inadequate, and she'd noticed the hay storage wasn't covered well enough for the wet season, and Hector had mentioned something in passing about a section of the creek that ran along the east boundary being lower than usual. These were not catastrophes. They were the kind of slow problems that didn't announce themselves as problems until they got expensive. She was sitting there reading old numbers by lamplight at midnight when she heard a sound from the hallway. Footsteps, deliberate and not trying to be quiet. They stopped outside her door. Then, after a moment, continued past it and down the stairs. She sat very still and listened to the boots descend, cross the floor below, and move out toward what she thought was probably the kitchen. Then silence. She looked at her lamp. She looked at the door. Then she put on her boots. Not just the coat now, the boots too, because her father had said a woman alone should never be entirely unarmed, and she'd decided to apply that logic broadly, and went downstairs. He was at the kitchen table, not eating, not drinking, just sitting, forearms flat on the table, looking at nothing. The lamp was low. He'd clearly done this before, in this room, in this posture. It had the feeling of a practiced habit. He heard her on the stairs and didn't startle, just said, without turning, "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she said. "I was already up." She came in and stood near the window because she didn't want to sit down without being asked, and she didn't want to leave because that felt strange too. The kitchen was warm, banked embers in the stove, and smelled like coffee from dinner and wood smoke and the particular smell of old cast iron. You look at the ledger books you brought, he said. It wasn't a question either. I was reading, she said. My wife used to do that, he said. Not ledgers. She read everything else. She'd be up at midnight sometimes with a lamp and some books she'd read before and was reading again. He said it flatly, not looking for a response. She didn't give him one, because sometimes a statement is just a statement, and the kindest thing you can do is let it be. After a moment, he said, I want you to know I didn't ask for this arrangement. Neither did I, she said. I know, he said. Gerald Bennett is a man who makes decisions for other people. He is, she said. I need you to know that I'll honor the agreement in practical terms, he said. This is your home. You'll have everything you need, but I can't promise. He stopped, started again. I don't know how to do this. The honesty of it landed differently than she'd expected. She'd been prepared for coldness, for business-like distance, even for dismissal. She hadn't quite been prepared for I don't know how to do this. I don't either, she said. I thought I'd be running my father's ranch by now. He looked at her then, for the first time since she'd come downstairs. The lamplight made his face less guarded than it had been at dinner. Not open, exactly, but the way a face looks when the effort of maintaining an expression has lapsed for a moment. What do you actually know how to do? He asked. Not unkindly, genuinely. Ranching, she said. Books, livestock, weather, keeping things from falling apart quietly. That last one's specific, he said. It's the most important one, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, Get some sleep, Miss Bennett. He pushed back from the table. Morning comes early here. I'm sure it does, she said. He left the kitchen. She stood alone in the warm room, listening to him climb the stairs, and thought about what he'd said. I don't know how to do this. And found herself, for the first time since Gerald had pushed that contract across the breakfast table, feeling something that wasn't quite fear. It wasn't hope exactly either. It was something in between, too small to name and too real to dismiss. She turned down the lamp and went back to bed. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and clear, the stars thrown across the sky in the reckless way of country that had no lights to compete with them. The ranch settled around her. Somewhere out in the dark, something moved through the grass. The next morning, she was up before the hands. She was up before the hands, and that was how she found the first problem. The eastern water trough, the long one that served the near pasture where they kept the younger cattle, had a split along the bottom seam, old and badly patched with something that had given up overnight. The water was draining out into the mud around it, which had been happening long enough that the mud had a particular quality to it, deep and worked and foul-smelling, the kind that came from days of slow leaking rather than one sudden failure. The young cattle were crowded at the far end where a thin column of water still collected, pushing against each other, the smaller ones getting shouldered out. Rosalie stood there in the early gray light in her coat and boots and took stock of what she was looking at. Then she went to the barn. The barn was occupied by a man she hadn't met yet, short, bow-legged, with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 30 years looking into weather. He was forking hay and didn't stop when she came in. The east trough has failed, she said. He kept forking. I know. How long? 2 days, maybe 3. She waited. And? He looked at her for the first time. And Mr. Thornton's been in Billings. I was going to tell him when he got back. He got back yesterday, she said. The man set down the fork. He had the expression of someone reassessing a situation they thought they had figured out. I'm Denny Marsh, he said. I run the barn and the near pasture. Rosalie Thornton, she said. And it was the first time she'd used the name, and it felt strange in her mouth, like a coat that didn't quite fit yet. The trough needs to be pulled and reseated. Do you have the materials? We've got pine boards. I don't know about the pitch. Check the supply shed. If there's no pitch, we need to send someone to town today and get that trough wrapped as a temporary fix until the real repair is done. Those young animals can't be short on water. Denny looked at her for a long moment. He wasn't hostile. Not quite. He had the look of a man taking inventory, adding things up in a column he hadn't expected to need. I'll check the shed, he said. Thank you, she said, and left him to it. She was back at the house, and at the kitchen table with Martha's coffee before the hands were fully up, and she'd already made a short list in the margin of her father's ledger, not in the main columns, just the margin, because she wasn't sure yet what she had the standing to do, of the 3 things she'd noticed on the drive in and the 1 thing she'd found this morning. Martha set a plate in front of her without being asked. Eggs, bacon, 2 slices of bread that were slightly charred on one side because the stove ran hot in the back left corner, which Rosalie had already noted and intended never to mention because it seemed like the kind of thing Martha knew about and had made her own peace with. "You're up early," Martha said. "I sleep light," Rosalie said. "Mr. Thornton sleeps light too," Martha said, in the careful tone of someone sharing information they have not been asked to share. Rosalie ate her eggs and said nothing, and Martha seemed satisfied with that. Caleb came down at 6:30. He stopped when he saw her at the table, and she saw him recalibrate in the same small way he'd done at dinner, the slight adjustment of a man who keeps encountering something in a place he didn't put it. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "The east trough has failed. Denny's checking the supply shed for pitch. If there isn't any, someone needs to go to town today." He poured himself coffee. "How long's it been failed?" "Denny said 2 or 3 days. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He should have caught that. "He was waiting for you to get back from Billings," she said. She didn't editorialize on this. She just stated it. Caleb sat down across from her with his coffee, and she noticed he sat closer than he had at dinner, the long table not between them now, just the width of a normal kitchen surface. He had a way of taking up space that was more about attention than size. He was present in a room in a way that made you aware of it. "I'll go out and look," he said. "There's also a drainage issue along the north field," she said. "I noticed it on the drive in. The grade's running toward the fence line rather than away from it. It's not an emergency now, but in wet season it will be." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You noticed that from the road." "I was paying attention," she said. "Most people notice the house," he said. "The house is fine," she said. "The drainage will cost you." Another recalibration. Smaller this time, which meant either she was making more sense to him or he was getting better at hiding his surprise. She couldn't tell which yet. "I'll ride the north field this afternoon," he said. "You can come if you want." "All right," she said. Martha, at the stove, moved a pan from one burner to another with the deliberate unhurriedness of a woman who is not listening to the conversation. The town found out about the trough problem before noon, which was how small towns worked. Not through malice, exactly, just through the natural motion of information in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, because the alternative was boredom. Hector had gone in for supplies and mentioned it at the dry goods store, and by the time Rosalie rode in with him to pick up the pitch, the story had already been altered in the retelling. She heard the first version outside the dry goods store from 2 women she didn't know, spoken in that carrying undertone people use when they want to be heard without appearing to intend it. "Apparently she's been walking around the property since dawn telling the men what to do. Gerald Bennett's niece, the big one? She arrived yesterday, hasn't been there 24 hours, and she's already taking over." Rosalie went into the store. She bought the pitch and 2 additional items she'd noticed were needed, and she was polite to the man behind the counter, who was polite back in the careful way of a man unsure what to make of her. She did not address the women outside. She had decided on the way into town that Silver Creek would form its opinion of her the same way every place formed its opinion of everyone, slowly, through accumulated evidence, and that trying to shape that opinion through argument was the least efficient approach available. Hector drove back in silence, which she'd come to understand was his natural state rather than unfriendliness. "How long have you worked here?" she asked, halfway back. 4 years, he said. "Since I was 16. "You like it?" He thought about this with the seriousness of someone for whom the question wasn't simple. "It's fair work," he said finally. "Mr. Thornton's fair." "What does that mean specifically?" "He pays on time. He doesn't ask you to do things he wouldn't do himself. When my mother was sick last winter, he let me have 2 weeks. He paused. He doesn't talk much, but he's fair." She thought about the man sitting at the kitchen table at midnight, looking at nothing. He's complicated, Martha had said, but not bad. The men on the crew, she said. How do they feel about me being here? Hector was quiet for a moment. Some of them think it'll last a month, he said, with the honesty of someone who'd decided that being direct was less risky than being indirect. Some think less. And you? He looked at her sideways. I saw you in the barn with Denny at 6 a.m, he said. Denny doesn't take direction from most people. He listened to you. He listened because I was right, she said. Yes, ma'am, Hector said. That's usually how it works with Denny. The Northfield ride that afternoon was the first time she and Caleb were alone together in open country, which was different from being alone in a house. In a house there were rooms and doors, and the kind of proximity that has walls around it. On horseback in open country, there was just the land and the sky and the fact of each other. He rode well. She noted it the way she noted everything. Not admiringly, just accurately. He had the ease of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback without thinking about it, the kind of seat that came from decades rather than effort. She rode her own way, which her father had taught her, which was not exactly graceful but was effective. She'd had men comment on her riding before, usually not charitably. Caleb said nothing about it. They rode the north fence line for about 20 minutes before she pointed out the drainage slope. He got down and crouched and looked at the grade of the ground, pressed his fingers into the soil in 2 places, stood up and looked toward the fence line, and then back toward the field. It's been wet this spring, he said. I thought the standing water near the north fence was just runoff. It's draining toward the fence, she said. When the wet season really hits, you'll lose that section of fence, possibly more. The ground under it will go soft. He stood there looking at it. She waited. She'd learned that men who were actually thinking needed to be given room to think, and men who were just performing thought would fill the silence with explanation. She wanted to see which one he was. He didn't fill the silence. He just looked at the ground and the fence and the lay of the land for a full 2 minutes, and then he said, My foreman missed this. Your foreman might have had other priorities, she said. That's generous, he said. I'm not trying to be generous, she said. I'm trying to be accurate. A 12,000-acre operation has a lot of competing priorities. Things slip. He looked at her. You're not what I expected. I know, she said. Gerald told me you'd need looking after, he said. He stopped. What did he say? He got back on his horse. She waited. He settled into the saddle and looked across the field for a moment before he said you were a big-hearted woman with limited practical experience and that I should be patient with you. The words landed with the particular quality of a small blow, not devastating, but sharp. She'd heard variations of this characterization her whole life and had never quite gotten used to it, the way other people's low estimation of her arrived like a fact she was supposed to accept. That's what he said, she repeated. It's not what I'm seeing, Caleb said. There was nothing particularly warm in how he said it. It was as plain and observational as everything else he'd said, but it was the most direct acknowledgement she'd received from anyone since she'd arrived, and it was accurate, and accurate mattered more to her than warm. I know, she said again, and they rode back to the ranch. But the trouble with the hands started on the 4th day. It started small, the way these things always did, not with confrontation, but with the spaces around it. A joke she wasn't meant to hear but was clearly meant to be audible. A task she'd mentioned that got done in exactly the wrong way, not wrong enough to argue about, but wrong in the specific way that communicated something about the man who'd done it. 2 men sitting down to lunch too slowly when she was waiting to ask them something, making her stand there longer than necessary. She knew this pattern. She'd seen it on her father's ranch when new authority arrived. The testing, the minor insubordinations, the collective waiting to see what would break first. The man running most of it was named Cord. He was the longest-serving hand on the property after Denny, mid-40s, with the kind of confidence that came from being good at his work and knowing it. He wasn't mean, exactly. He just had a very settled idea of how things worked, and who gave directions to whom. And Rosalie did not fit into that idea. On the 4th day, she found 3 of the cattle she'd asked to be moved to the south pasture, still in the east pasture, which was already overgrazed. She found Cord near the fence, mending wire, and she asked him about it. Didn't get to it, he said, without looking up from the wire. It needs to be done today, she said. The east pasture is running short. I've got 6 other things ahead of it, he said. What 6 things? He looked up then. He had gray eyes and a weathered face, and the particular stillness of a man who was not accustomed to being asked to account for himself to anyone he didn't consider his superior. Ma'am, he said, and the title was almost polite, almost, I take my orders from Mr. Thornton. Mr. Thornton asked me to handle the pasture rotation, she said, which was not entirely true. Caleb had not said those words, but was also not entirely false, because they discussed it at breakfast, and he'd said she could take it on if she wanted. Cord looked at her in a long, considering way. I'll get to it, he said. When I get to it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, Fine, and walked away. She found Caleb in the office, a small room off the front hallway with a desk buried under paper, which told her the books were being managed but not well organized. And she told him what had happened flatly, without editorializing. He listened. I'll talk to Cord, he said. I'm not asking you to fight my battles, she said. I'm telling you there's a coordination problem. If the men don't know what authority I have, they'll assume I have none. He looked up from the paper he'd been reading. What are you asking for? A clear statement, she said, to them, that when I ask something done, it gets done. He was quiet for a moment. That's a significant thing to ask for 4 days in. I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. He held her gaze. She could see him running through it, the complications, the dynamics, the risk of undermining his existing crew structure, the separate risk of what it looked like if he didn't. She'd thought it through herself and knew both sides of it. I'll talk to Cord, he said again, and this time it meant something different. That evening she heard them outside. Not the words, just the tone. Caleb's voice level and final, Cord's initially resistant and then, after a pause, quieter. She was at the desk in the bedroom with the ledger books, and she kept her eyes on the page and didn't try to hear what was being said. The next morning, the cattle were in the south pasture. Well, the storm came at the end of the second week, and it was the storm that started changing things. Not a wildfire, that was later, and different, and worse. This was a spring storm, the kind that rolled in off the northern plains without much warning and hit hard for a short time before moving on. Rain, lightning, hard wind. The kind of weather that wasn't dangerous to experienced people if they were prepared, and was very dangerous to experienced people who weren't. She woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of the rain against the east window, and lay there for a moment listening, and then sat up, because something in the sound of it was wrong. Too much rain, too fast. She was dressed and out the door in 3 minutes. The sky to the north was lit with heat lightning, and the wind was coming from that direction, which meant the storm's worst was still coming. She crossed the yard to the barn and found Hector already there, wide-eyed, with a lantern. Where's Denny? She said. Bunkhouse, I think, Hector said. Should I get him? Get everybody, she said. Then come back here and start moving the horses to the back stalls. Get them away from the south wall. The south wall's fine, Hector said. The south wall has a seam in the roof I noticed 2 days ago, she said. If the wind shifts, that seam opens up and you've got horses and lightning in the same space. Move them. She didn't wait to see if he was going to argue. She went to the cattle shed and assessed what she was dealing with. 20 young cattle in the near enclosure, a fence on the east side that had been in her notes since day one as a concern, and the particular way the ground sloped toward the creek, which meant if the creek rose, and with this much rain it would, the low corner of the enclosure would flood. She started opening the gate to the higher ground enclosure before anyone else arrived. Denny got there at the same time as 3 of the other hands, all of them in various states of undress, confused and squinting in the lantern light. Cord was among them. He looked at the open gate and at Rosalie, and his expression went through several things in quick succession. What's happening? Denny said. Creek's going to rise, she said. East low corner of this enclosure will flood. We need to move these animals to the upper yard before it gets worse. Denny, can you take the south side and work them toward the gate? Denny looked at the sky, looked at the slope of the ground, looked at the cattle. Yeah, he said. That's right. Let's go. They moved through the dark and the rain for the next 40 minutes. The lightning came closer as they worked, not close enough to stop, just close enough to make everything feel precarious. Two of the younger cattle didn't want to move and required patient, quiet work to coax toward the gate. Cord, she noticed, handled that part without being asked and without complaint, which told her something she filed away. The creek rose. She'd been right about the timing. By the time the last animal was through the gate, the low corner was ankle deep. She was standing in the rain watching it happen when she felt someone come up beside her. Caleb. He'd come out at some point during the operation. She hadn't registered exactly when, and he'd apparently just been watching. "I would have lost 12 animals in that corner," he said. "Maybe 10, she said. "Probably not all 12. 10 is a significant number." "Yes," she said. The rain was heavy on her shoulders, and she was thoroughly soaked, and she was too tired to care about it. "I noticed the drainage slope on the first week. I should have had it addressed sooner." "You've been here 2 weeks," he said. "The problem was there before I got here," she said. "But I saw it, and I didn't move fast enough." He was quiet. She could feel him looking at her in the way he'd looked at the drainage slope, not performing thought, but actually doing it. "You're blaming yourself for something that's been a problem for 3 years, he said. "I'm noting that I could have prevented tonight," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." The storm was moving off already. The worst of it passed in the way of these fast northern squalls. The rain thinned. The lightning was farther away. "Come inside," Caleb said. "Martha'll have something hot." She went. Behind her, she could hear the hands talking. Their voices had a different quality than they'd had in the first days, looser, the kind of talk that happened between people who'd just done something together. Cord's voice was in there. She heard him say something she couldn't make out, and then Hector said, "She knew about the seam in the barn roof 2 days ago." And there was a pause, and Cord said, "Huh." That was all, but it was enough. Bah. Martha had coffee and cornbread and the particular warmth of someone who had been up the whole time knowing they'd be needed. She set everything on the table without fuss and went back to the stove. Caleb sat across from Rosalie and wrapped both hands around his cup. She noticed his hands for the first time properly. Large, calloused, a scar across the right knuckle that looked old, a working man's hands that didn't match the careful way he spoke. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "The creek, the drainage. How did you know?" "My father," she said. "He lost a section of fence to creek rise when I was 12. He walked me through exactly what he'd missed and exactly why, and then he made me walk him through it back until he was sure I had it. He taught you like you'd be running it yourself one day." "He did," she said. "I think he always planned to leave it to me. He just didn't plan on leaving it as fast as he did." Caleb looked at his coffee for a moment. "My father left this place to me at 30. I thought I was ready. Spent the first 3 years discovering everything I didn't know." "What's left to discover?" she asked. Something flickered across his face. Not amusement exactly, but something close, a kind of recognition. "Less than there used to be," he said. She drank her coffee. The rain was down to a thin sound on the roof. Outside, she could hear the hands going back to the bunkhouse. "Rosalie," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss, and he seemed to notice it at the same moment she did, a brief pause, his expression not quite changing. "What do you want from this? From being here?" It was an honest question and deserved an honest answer, and she was too tired to construct a diplomatic one. "I want to do useful work," she said. "I want to be somewhere I'm not just waiting for someone to tell me I'm allowed to be there." She paused. "I'd like to not go back to Gerald's house. That's the minimum." He didn't smile, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, slightly, the way a man's posture changes when he decides something. "You're not going back to Gerald's house," he said, as plainly as if he were stating a fact about the weather. She held his eyes for a moment. He held hers back. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll need to check the east fence at first light. Probably lost 2 or 3 posts in the low corner." "Probably 4, she said. "Probably 4, he agreed, and for the second time she thought she saw the ghost of something on his face that might, in a different version of things, have been a smile. She went upstairs. She pulled off her wet coat and her wet boots and sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself the precise amount of exhaustion she'd been holding back for 2 weeks. Then she lay down, and this time the bed didn't feel like someone else's luck. It felt, tentatively, like the beginning of something that might eventually be hers. But the town had not finished deciding what to make of her, and there were people in Silver Creek with reasons to want her gone, and the comfortable thing that was starting to happen between her and Caleb Thornton was exactly the kind of thing that certain men found threatening. Outside the warm house, in the wet dark after the storm, the pieces of a harder problem were already in motion. She didn't know that yet. For one night, she just slept. She lost 4 fence posts in the low corner, exactly as she predicted, and found a 5th one she hadn't expected, older rot underneath that the storm had finished off. Caleb was already at the east fence when she got there at first light, crouched down looking at the damage with the expression of a man adding numbers he didn't enjoy. 5, she said. 5, he agreed, and stood up. I'll have cord pull replacements from the lumber stack. They walked the rest of the fence line together in the early morning, the ground still soft and giving underfoot, the air carrying that particular post-storm smell of wet earth and washed grass that Rosalie had known since childhood. She'd always found it clarifying, the smell of things that had been through something and survived it. The east fence ran 3/4 of a mile before it hit the creek boundary, and they walked most of it without talking, which she'd stopped finding uncomfortable. Caleb moved through his land with a specific quality of attention. He wasn't inspecting it the way a man checks a ledger, he was reading it, the way someone reads a face they know well enough to notice when something is off. She watched that quality of attention and recognized it, because her father had had it too, and it was not something you could teach, exactly. It was something you developed by caring about a place long enough. The Aldridge property starts there, he said at one point, gesturing past the creek to the east. Their fence line's been moving. Moving how? She said. Slowly. 6 inches here, a foot there. Their surveyor and mine disagreed last fall. I let it go because it wasn't worth the fight. She looked across the creek. The land on the other side was good land. Not as well managed as the Thornton side, she could see that even at a distance, but good underlying country. Is it worth the fight now? She said. It might become worth it, he said. She filed that away with everything else. The name Aldridge was not new to her. She'd heard it in town on her second supply run. Not spoken directly to her, but close enough that she was meant to catch it. Warren Aldridge ran the second largest spread in the county, and the way people said his name had 2 distinct registers. The register for someone powerful, and the register for someone people were careful about. She'd learned to tell the difference in those 2 kinds of careful. They were halfway back to the house when Caleb said, without preamble, Aldridge came to see me in Billings. She waited. Before you arrived, he said. He made an offer on the east section, 30 acres along the creek boundary. He said he needed the water access for his summer herd. And I told him no, Caleb said. That creek is 1/3 of my summer water supply. Selling him access to the boundary would mean negotiating every summer for what's mine. What did he say? He said he understood, shook my hand. Caleb paused. He was too agreeable about it. A man like Aldridge doesn't take no with a handshake and a smile unless he's already decided to go around you. Rosalie thought about this. What does going around you look like? I don't know yet, Caleb said. And the fact that he said it, that he admitted not knowing to her, standing in the mud at first light, was something she marked as significant. The rumors reached her on a Tuesday, delivered by Martha with the particular directness of someone who considered it more charitable to say the thing plainly than to let it arrive sideways. There's talk in town, Martha said, setting a lunch plate in front of Rosalie, that you married Mr. Thornton for the property. Rosalie cut her bread. I know, she said. You know? I heard something in that direction last week at the dry goods store. She ate a bite. Is it new talk or old talk getting louder? Martha sat down across from her, which she sometimes did at lunch and never did at dinner, a distinction Rosalie had decided meant something about what was being discussed. It's getting louder, she said. Someone's been talking to the newspaper man. What does the newspaper man have to say? Nothing yet, but a man who comes to ask questions about you and leaves writing in his notebook has usually already decided what his story is. Rosalie was quiet for a moment, She knew exactly what the story would be because it was the easiest story. A heavy-set woman from an indebted family had arranged a marriage to one of the wealthiest men in the county. The audience for that story already believed it. The only question was how loud it got and whether it had a source giving it shape. "Who's talking to the newspaper man?" she asked. Martha looked at her hands. "I don't know for certain." "But you have a guess?" Martha looked up. Warren Aldridge had breakfast at the Silver Creek Inn the same morning that newspaper man started asking questions, she said. "I'm not saying one caused the other." "You're saying they happened on the same morning," Rosalie said. "I'm saying that," Martha said. Rosalie ate her lunch and thought about what it meant to be the story someone else was writing about you. The particular helplessness of it, the way other people's narratives could arrive before you did and sit in a room waiting, so that when you walked in, everyone had already decided what they were seeing. She'd lived inside that problem her whole life. She'd never been able to outrun it. But she'd learned that you couldn't argue a story to death either. The only thing that killed a bad story was a true one, and a true one took time. She finished her lunch and went out to help Cord and the others with the fence replacement. Cord watched her pick up a post and position it without asking him to show her how, and he said nothing about it. After a few minutes, he handed her the level without being asked, and she used it, and when she gave it back, he said, "You're not what Hector said either." "What did Hector say?" "He said you were smart," Cord said, "but Hector thinks most people are smarter than they are." He drove a stake into the soft ground with 3 efficient blows. "You're not just smart, you know the work." "My father taught me," she said. "A lot of fathers teach daughters to cook," Cord said. "My father needed someone who could help him run a ranch," she said. "He worked with what he had." Cord snorted, not unkindly. "Well," he said, and nothing more, and they went back to the fence. But the quality of the silence between them had shifted, and she noted it. The newspaper piece ran on a Friday. Rosalie read it standing in the dry goods store while the owner pretended to organize something behind the counter. It was not vicious. It was worse than vicious because it was careful. It didn't say she'd married Caleb for money. It said she came from a family with significant debts, that the marriage had been arranged quickly following her father's death, that she had arrived at Thornton Ranch and immediately begun involving herself in operations decisions. The facts were all true. The arrangement of them was a story about a woman using a man. She folded the paper and put it back on the stack and bought her supplies and went back to the wagon. Hector, beside her on the seat, had clearly already read it or heard about it. He drove with the careful expression of someone keeping his thoughts to himself. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking Mr. Thornton's going to be angry," Hector said. "About the piece?" "About what it implies," Hector said. "He's private. He doesn't like his name in papers." She thought about what Caleb would do with Angry and felt uncertain in a way she hadn't felt in a while. She'd learned some things about him in 4 weeks. That he was fair, that he was honest, that his silences meant different things in different contexts, that he was capable of deciding things quickly and holding them once decided. She did not know what he did with the particular anger of having been written about publicly in a way that implied he'd been manipulated by a woman. She found out that evening. He was in the office when she got back. She could hear him in there. Not shouting, but the particular quality of quiet that sometimes precedes shouting, like the stillness before a storm. She went to the doorway. He was standing at the window with the newspaper on the desk, and he turned when she came in. "Have you seen it?" he said. "In town," she said. "Yes." "Aldridge," he said. It wasn't a question. "Most likely." "Most certain," he said. "I know how he operates. He can't get the land, so he goes after the reputation." He picked up the paper and then put it back down, a gesture of controlled frustration. "This isn't about you. I want to be clear. This is about him finding a lever." "I know," she said. "But it's still about me." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, and the honesty of that acknowledgement, the willingness to not argue with what was plainly true, was something she registered. "What do you want to do about it?" "Nothing yet," she said. "Nothing?" "Responding gives it more weight," she said. "Aldridge wants a reaction. A reaction means the story has legs. If we don't give him a reaction, he has to do something bigger to get one, and something bigger is harder to do carefully." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this. I grew up a large woman in a world that had opinions about that, she said. I've been thinking about other people's stories about me my whole life. Something moved in his face then. Not pity, she was certain of that. She'd have known pity and would have ended the conversation immediately. It was something closer to recognition. The particular recognition of a person seeing a problem they hadn't considered from the angle of the person who'd been living inside it. All right, he said, we don't respond. Not yet, she said. He nodded. Then he looked down at the desk and said, almost as an aside, for what it's worth, anyone who's been here 4 weeks and thinks you married me for money hasn't watched you work. She left before he could see what that did to her expression. June came in hot and dry, which was ordinary for that part of Montana, but the dryness had an edge to it this year that old Denny recognized and didn't like. He came to Rosalie with it before he came to Caleb, which was now, without announcement, simply how some things worked at Thornton Ranch. Grass is burning off faster than it should, he said one morning, standing at the edge of the south pasture. We had less snowpack this winter, creeks down already. She looked at the grass. He was right. Not obviously. Not to someone who hadn't been watching it for weeks, but the color was off by a degree, the particular shade of green that was a week away from yellow. We need to rotate the south herd now, she said. Not next week. The north pasture's not ready, Denny said. It'll be less unready than the south pasture in 2 weeks, she said. Start the rotation tomorrow. Mr. Thornton, I'll tell him tonight, she said. She did. Caleb agreed without much discussion, which was how it went now when she brought him something that had numbers and logic behind it. He listened. He asked 1 or 2 precise questions. He decided. It was one of the things about him she'd come to find genuinely useful. He could disaggregate his preferences from his judgment. He might have preferred a different approach, but if the numbers said otherwise, the numbers won. They were sitting on the porch after dinner when she told him about the grass, and he'd asked his 2 questions and said to do the rotation, and then they sat for a while in the particular evening quiet of open country cooling after a hot day. This had become its own habit, the post-dinner porch time, irregular but recurring, neither of them suggesting it, and neither of them not. The distance between them was smaller than it had been. Not small, she was careful about that word, but smaller. Tell me about her, Rosalie said. She hadn't planned to say it. It arrived the way honest things sometimes did, from a place that was tired of not saying the obvious. He went very still. Martha told you, he said. Martha told me you were a widower, she said. That's all she said. He was quiet for a long time. The evening light moved across the open country in the way it did out here, slowly and with color, nothing like the quick darkening of places where there were trees to hurry it along. Her name was Clara, he said finally. She died 3 years ago. Fever. It was fast, faster than anyone expected. She was sick on a Tuesday and gone by Sunday. I'm sorry, Rosalie said, and meant it simply. She would have thought the newspaper piece was funny, he said. She had a way of finding the comedy in things that were trying to be serious. He paused. She would have said something specific about Aldridge that I can't repeat in present company. Something in Rosalie's chest loosened slightly. She sounds like she was clear-eyed. She was the clearest person I ever knew, he said. She saw through things. Not in a harsh way, just directly. He looked at the distant line of hills going dark against the sky. It took me a long time to stop expecting her to walk into a room. Rosalie said nothing. Sometimes nothing was the only response that didn't diminish the thing being said. I want you to know that's not... He stopped, started again. I'm telling you that so you understand the shape of things here, what I was before you arrived. Not as an explanation for anything that's been lacking, just so you know. I understand the shape of things, she said quietly. He looked at her then in the low light, with the directness that she'd come to understand was not hardness, but its own kind of honesty. I think you do, he said. They sat until the dark came fully and then went inside, and neither of them said anything more about it, and that felt right too. The fire started on a Thursday in the 3rd week of June. She smelled it before she heard anything, that particular dry season smell that was distinct from wood smoke or cook fire, the smell of grass burning, which had a quality of openness to it, a wideness, because grass fire moved with the wind and the wind moved across everything. She was in the barn with Denny when she caught it. She stopped mid-sentence. "You smell that?" she said. Denny lifted his head. His face went still in the way of a man whose experience made the next 30 seconds move faster than most people's. "South," he said. "Valley side," she said. "The wind's from the southwest." They came out of the barn at the same time that Hector came running from the far side of the property, and behind him she could see it. Not the fire itself yet, but the smoke, low and yellow-gray, moving with the wind in the direction of the south pasture, where she'd rotated the herd 10 days ago. She did the calculation in the time it took her to cross the yard to where Caleb was just coming out of the house. "South pasture," she said. "The herd's there. Wind southwest, and there's nothing between the fire and the pasture except dry ground." He was already moving. "I'll get the men." "The men need to start a break line," she said, "north of the pasture, between the pasture and the barn. If the fire reaches the barn—" "I know," he said. "The horses first," she said. "Move the horses out of the south barn before anything else." He stopped and looked at her, just for a second, the look of a man running multiple plans simultaneously and checking one against another. "Where are you going?" "Into the south pasture," she said. "The herd won't move without pressure from behind, and they'll panic if they hear the fire before they can see an exit." "Rosalie, I know cattle," she said. "Let me go." He held her gaze for one hard second. Then, "Cord goes with you." She was already moving. The smoke was thicker by the time she and Cord reached the south pasture gate. Not choking yet, but purposeful, moving with the wind, and she could feel the heat now, too. Not intense, not close, but the way heat telegraphs itself ahead of a grass fire, a warmth to the air that didn't belong in the afternoon. The herd was already bunched and restless at the north end of the pasture, away from the smoke, which was good. Cattle had better sense about fire than they sometimes got credit for. But bunched and restless was one loud sound away from bunched and stampeding. "We keep them calm," she said to Cord. "Slow pressure from the south, walking pace, work them toward the north gate. Don't run. Don't shout." "I've moved cattle in smoke before," Cord said, not irritably, just as a statement of fact. "Good," she said. "Then you go left flank. I'll take right." They went in. It was the kind of work that narrowed the world to its essential elements. The animals in front of her, the smoke moving on the wind, the sound of the fire she couldn't yet see but could locate precisely from the sound it made in dry grass, which was a specific crackle and hiss distinct from every other sound in the world. She kept her horse slow. She kept her voice low. The cattle moved. She didn't think about anything else, not Aldridge, not the newspaper piece, not the new and complicated shape of things with Caleb, not Gerald, not the life she'd had before any of this. There was just the movement and the smoke and the animals that needed to be somewhere other than where they were. They were 3/4 of the way through the herd when the wind shifted. It shifted the way wind shifts in open country, without warning, because warning is a feature of smaller spaces. And out here, the wind did what it wanted. It swung from southwest to south-southeast, and the smoke swung with it, and what had been coming from behind them was suddenly coming from the left. And Cord's flank horses shied, and 2 cattle at the rear broke away from the group toward the east fence. She felt Cord's side of the operation destabilize before she heard it. The herd pressure changed, the animals she was moving started to look backward, and to the left instead of forward. She didn't hesitate. She drove her horse wide right, ahead of the main group, and turned them, forced them north toward the gate through sheer insistence, staying between the animals and the direction they wanted to go, which was sideways, which was wrong, which would scatter them into the smoke. It cost her 40 feet. She was closer to the south end of the pasture than she'd planned, and the heat on the south side was real now, not ambient. It had an edge to it, a direction. The fire had crossed a gully she'd thought would slow it. "Gates open," she heard Hector shouting from the north end. "They're through. Most of them are through." Most. She looked back. 3 animals still in the south section, near the east fence where they'd broken. She looked at the smoke. She went back in. Cord shouted something behind her that she caught the beginning of and lost in the wind. She didn't stop. The three animals were at the east fence, pressed against it, which was the worst place. They'd run the fence line instead of through the gate if she came at them straight. She came at them from the east, putting herself between them and the fence, and for a second it didn't work. They pressed harder against the wire, and she thought she was going to lose them and lose herself, and the whole calculation had been wrong. Then the lead animal saw the gate, turned. The other two followed. She was 20 feet behind them going through the gate when the south pasture fence behind her caught. The dry wood post going quickly, not dramatically, but with a conviction that said the whole line would follow. She pulled up past the gate and Hector shut it behind her, his face white under the dirt. "Ma'am," he said, which was all. She sat on her horse and breathed for a moment. Her hands were trembling slightly, which she noted as information rather than weakness. The smoke was blowing north now, thick and yellow and real, and she could see three of the ranch hands with shovels working the brake line north of where she'd just been. She turned her horse toward the brake line. Cord appeared at her side. He'd gotten his horses under control and come back, and he rode beside her for a moment and said nothing. Then he said, "3 animals." "I counted 3, she said. "Most men would have called it close enough," he said. "They weren't close enough," she said. "They were still in the pasture." He didn't say anything more. They rode toward the brake line. Caleb was there. He'd been working the shovels. She could see it in the way he was standing, the particular exhaustion of hard physical work done fast and hot. He watched her ride up, and his expression did something she couldn't fully read. Relief and something under it, something she didn't have a name for yet. The face of a man who had just been watching something he couldn't stop and hadn't been able to stop. "Herd's out," she said. "I saw you go back in," he said. 3 animals at the fence." "I saw," he said. There was a flatness in how he said it that had nothing to do with absence of feeling. The brake line held. The fire burned what it was going to burn. The south pasture, 2 fence sections, a storage shed at the far south end that had been empty, and then it ran out of fuel at the break and moved east into country that was rockier and harder to burn, and by evening it was down to smoke rather than flame. They lost the south pasture grass for the rest of the season. They lost the 2 fence sections and the shed. They did not lose the barn, the horses, the herd, or the house. The ranch hands collapsed on the ground near the water trough in small groups, drinking and not talking, the particular silence of people who had done hard physical work at high stakes and were not yet ready to process the fact that it was over. Rosalie dismounted and let Hector take her horse, and stood there for a moment feeling the specific weight of her own body, which had not quite caught up with the fact that the emergency had ended. Martha appeared from the house with water and bread, and an expression of someone who had been waiting with contained terror and was now releasing it incrementally. Caleb stood a few feet away. He'd been talking to Denny about the brake line, and now Denny had walked away, and Caleb stood with his hat in his hand, looking across the scorched south end of his property. She went and stood beside him. He didn't look at her. He kept looking at the blackened ground, the 2 sections of ruined fence, the smoke still drifting up from the south in thin columns. She stood there and didn't try to fill the silence. "Gerald told me you'd need looking after," he said finally. The same words he'd said weeks ago, riding the north fence, but this time with a different weight. Not reporting Gerald's opinion, but measuring the distance between Gerald's opinion and what was standing beside him. "Gerald was wrong," she said. "I know," Caleb said, and then, after a moment, "I'm sorry I didn't say so sooner." It was not a large statement. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without theater, looking at the burned ground rather than at her, but it landed the way plain true things land when you've been waiting a long time for them, with a kind of specific heaviness that was nothing like disappointment. "You're saying it now," she said. He put his hat back on. He looked at the smoke, the damaged fence line, the herd that was all accounted for and standing in the north pasture. He looked at all of it for a long moment. "What do you need tonight?" he said. She thought about it. "Food," she said. "And for someone to look at the north fence tomorrow morning to see if we can borrow any posts from there for the south sections." He made a sound that might, from another man, have been a laugh. "I'll have Cord look at it first light." "Good," she said. They walked back to the house. and behind them the smoke kept rising into the Montana evening, and above it the sky was going red and gold in the particular extravagant way of country with no buildings to interrupt it. Red and gold and enormous, the kind of sky that didn't care at all about what had happened underneath it, and was beautiful anyway. The morning after the fire, Silver Creek talked. She knew it before she went into town because Hector came back from the feed store with supplies and a particular set to his shoulders that meant he'd heard things he wasn't sure how to report. She let him unload the wagon before she asked. "What are they saying?" she said. He set down a feed sack and straightened up. "Some of them are saying you saved the herd," he said. "Some of them are saying you caused the fire." She waited. "Not directly," he said. "They're saying the rotation chapeau, moving the herd to the south pasture 10 days ago, is what put them in the fire's path. That if the herd had stayed where it was, the fire would have burned through empty ground, and there'd have been nothing to save." She thought about this with the care she gave to all information she didn't like, which was the same care she gave to information she did like, without the distortion of wanting it to be different than it was. The rotation had put the herd in the south pasture. That was true. The fire had started in the South Valley. That was also true. What was not true was the line between those two facts that Aldridge's version of events was trying to draw, because the fire had started in country that no one controlled and would have burned in whatever direction the wind took it, and the direction the wind had taken it was northwest, which would have brought it directly to the barn and the horses if the herd hadn't been there to provide a reason to cut a brake line in the right place. But that was a complicated truth, and complicated truths lost to simple ones in the kind of talk that happened over counters and on front porches. "Who's saying the second part?" she said. Hector picked up another feed sack. "I heard it from 2 different people," he said. "Both of them had been talking to men who work Aldridge's west section." She nodded. "All right," she said, and went to find Caleb. He was in the office, which was where he went when he was working through something he hadn't resolved. She'd learned to read the difference between the office for paperwork and the office for thinking. This was the second kind, the paper on the desk untouched, his attention somewhere else. She told him what Hector had said. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his consistent qualities. Well, he didn't interrupt, didn't finish sentences, didn't signal impatience. He just listened until there was nothing left to say, and then he thought about it. "He's shifting the story," Caleb said. "It was about you marrying me for money. Now it's about you making bad decisions that put my operation at risk." "He's building a pattern," she said. "A woman who came here for what she could get and doesn't know what she's doing. If enough people believe both halves, the whole thing becomes true whether it is or not." Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way he did when he was running numbers that weren't numerical. "I've been thinking about his fence line," he said, "the one that's been moving. Last fall, my surveyor told me it had shifted 14 inches east along the creek boundary. I didn't push it because I didn't want the dispute." He looked back at her. "I need to pull the original land grant documents, the ones filed when this ranch was established." She understood immediately. "If the original survey shows his fence is on your land, then I have more than a fence dispute," he said. "I have documentation of systematic encroachment, which is a different kind of conversation than neighbor disagreement." "Where are the documents?" she said. "Filed with the county seat," he said. "Billings." "How long to get them?" "A week, if I send someone today. Less if I go myself." "Then go yourself," she said. He looked at her. "That leaves you here without—" He stopped, reconsidered what he'd been about to say, and she saw him do it. "That leaves a lot of post-fire work with the fence sections." "Cord and I can manage the fence sections," she said. "That's 3 days of work at most. The documents are more important." He held her gaze for a moment. He did this. Measured her, but not the way people usually measured her, not by what she looked like or what she was supposed to be. He measured what she said against what he knew of how things actually worked. That was its own thing, and she'd come to value it without examining it too closely. "I'll leave tomorrow," he said. "I'll be back by Friday." "Good," she said, and left him to arrange it. He left at first light Tuesday, taking Hector with him, and the ranch settled into the particular rhythm of an operation running without its owner present. Rosalie had expected this to feel significant, a test or an opportunity, something weighted. Instead, it just felt like work, which was its own answer to whatever question she'd been half asking. She and Cord took the south fence sections on Tuesday afternoon. The work was hot and methodical and required coordination, pulling burned posts, setting new ones, stringing the wire with the right tension, which was not as simple as it looked, and which Cord did with the automatic accuracy of long practice. She worked beside him, and they found their rhythm quickly, which was still new enough to notice. Around midday, Cord said, without looking up from the wire stretcher, "You went back in for 3 animals." "We've been over this," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking about the animals." He clipped the wire and moved down the line. "I'm asking why. You had most of the herd, 3 animals at the fence with fire coming. Most people make the calculation and decide it's not worth it." She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I said I was going to move the herd," she said. "The herd was 3 animals short of moved." Cord was quiet for a moment. "That's not a practical reason." "No," she said. "It's not." He didn't push it further, which she appreciated. Some things didn't get more true when you explained them more, and he seemed to understand that. They finished the first fence section before sundown and started the second the following morning. Denny came out to help with the post setting, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd done it 100 times and wasn't trying to do it faster than that. The 3 of them worked through the morning and ate lunch in the partial shade of the north fence, sitting on the ground the way working people sit, without the ceremony of chairs. "Aldridge came by yesterday," Denny said. She looked up. "He came here?" "Rode to the south boundary," Denny said. "Stayed on his side of the line. Just sat there on his horse looking at the fire damage for about 10 minutes, then rode away." "He was assessing," Rosalie said. "That's what I thought," Denny said. He ate a bite of bread. "He had 2 men with him I haven't seen before. Not ranch hands. They were dressed wrong for ranch hands." She filed that away. "What did he do after he looked?" "Rode north on his boundary line. I watched him until I couldn't see him anymore." Denny paused. "He didn't look at the damage the way a neighbor looks at a neighbor's trouble. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's calculating." "I know what kind of look that is," she said. She rode the east boundary that afternoon, the one that ran along the creek where Aldridge's fence line had been creeping. She'd been meaning to do it since Caleb had mentioned it and hadn't found the time. Now she did. The creek was low, lower than it should be in June, another symptom of the dry winter Denny had predicted would cause problems. She followed it north along the boundary, looking at where the fence line sat relative to the creek bank, and what she found was more than 14 inches. In 3 places along the half-mile she rode, the Aldridge fence was clearly on the wrong side of the natural boundary markers, creek bends, rock formations, the kind of features that original surveyors used because they were permanent, not 14 inches. In 2 of the 3 places, closer to 4 feet, and in 1 place, almost 6. She dismounted and looked at the ground around the fence posts. The soil disturbance was wrong, too recent, at odds with how weathered the wire was. Someone had moved these posts. Not this season, but not many seasons ago either. The weathering on the wire and the newness of the disturbed soil around the bases didn't match, which meant the posts had been reset in the existing wire, placed into new holes while the wire stayed where it had always been. She stood there in the afternoon heat and understood exactly what she was looking at. Aldridge hadn't been moving his fence line organically, the way fence lines drift through years of small adjustments and no one paying attention. He'd been systematically relocating posts while leaving the wire, a method that disguised the age of the encroachment, because the old wire made everything look settled and long-standing. She pulled out the small notebook she'd started carrying in her coat pocket and made careful notes. Locations, descriptions of the soil disturbance, estimated measurements, the specific appearance of the post bases. Her father had taught her to write things down immediately and accurately because memory was the most unreliable document a person owned. She rode back to the ranch and went directly to the office, where she found a rough map of the property she'd seen pinned to the wall behind the desk. She studied it, located the 3 fence points from her ride, and marked them in pencil with the measurements she'd noted. Then she sat back and thought about the 2 men with Aldridge who hadn't been dressed like ranch hands. Caleb came back Friday as promised, arriving late afternoon with Hector in a leather satchel that contained what she needed to see. She met them at the barn and said, "How was Billings?" And he said, "Useful," and they went to the office. He spread the documents on the desk, the original land grant, the first survey maps, the county filing records going back to the establishment of Thornton Ranch. She leaned over the desk beside him and looked at them with the focus she gave to her father's ledger books, because documents of this kind told stories if you knew how to read them, and her father had taught her how to read them. "Here," Caleb said, pointing to the survey map. "The original eastern boundary runs 20 feet west of the creek's center line. That's standard for a water boundary in this county. Split the creek, each side owns to the middle." "And Aldridge's fence?" she said. "At 14 inches of encroachment, he's already passed the center line in the 3 places the surveyor identified last fall." He paused. "But I think it's worse than 14 inches. "It is," she said. She got her notebook and showed him what she'd found on the boundary ride. The 3 locations, the measurements, the mismatched weathering on posts and wire. He read her notes carefully. She watched him process them the same way he processed everything, without rushing. Then he said, "He reset the posts in existing wire." "That's what the soil disturbance says," she said. "It makes it look older than it is." "How long ago, do you think?" "Based on the weathering difference, 2, maybe 3 years, before your surveyor came out last fall." She paused. If he'd left the posts where they were, last fall's surveyor visit would have shown 14 inches of encroachment over 15 years of small drift, arguably a boundary dispute. With the resets, the actual encroachment is 4 to 6 feet in the places I checked, accomplished in 3 years. That's not drift. That's deliberate. Caleb was quiet. He looked at the survey map, then at her notebook, then at the map again. The quiet had the quality of a man making sure he was as angry as the situation warranted before he decided what to do with it. "He's been doing this while running the newspaper story," he said, "making noise about you, so I'm looking at the wrong problem." "While assessing fire damage from your boundary line," she said, "with men who weren't ranch hands." He looked up. "What were they?" "I don't know," she said. "But they weren't ranch hands. Aldridge ranches with working men, and they look like working men. These 2 were dressed for a different kind of work." Caleb put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the documents. "I need to take this to the county office," he said. "And I need to do it before Aldridge figures out that I have the original surveys." "How much time do we have?" "His visit to the south boundary was Tuesday," Caleb said. "He knows I've been gone. If he's smart, and he is, he'll assume I went to Billings for records." He straightened up. "We have until he can arrange to make those records complicated." "Can he do that?" "He has money, and he has relationships," Caleb said. "I don't know what he has at the county office specifically, but I don't want to find out by waiting." "Then go tomorrow," she said. "We go tomorrow," he said, and the "we" was deliberate, which she heard. They left before dawn, Caleb and Rosalie and Hector, taking the documents in the leather satchel and Rosalie's notebook and the rough map with her pencil markings. The drive to the county seat was 4 hours, which gave the morning time to come in fully and the heat to establish itself, and gave them time to talk in the way that travel made possible, side by side, facing the same direction, which was sometimes easier than facing each other. He asked her how the fence repair had gone, and she told him about Cord, and he listened with the particular quality of a man listening to something that confirmed things he'd suspected. He asked about the herd, and she said the herd was settled, and that Denny had moved them to the north pasture where there was enough grass for another 3 weeks, after which they'd need to make decisions about whether to bring supplemental feed or sell some of the summer calves early. "What do you think?" he said. "I think selling 20 calves at a small loss now is better than buying supplemental feed at full summer price," she said. "But you know this market better than I do. What are the buyers in this county like?" "Reliable enough," he said. "There's a broker in town named Els who's honest. I've used him before." "Talk to Els when we get back," she said, "before you need to. If he knows you might have calves, he'll come to you. If you go to him needing to sell, the price goes down." Caleb looked at her. "My father would have liked you," he said. It was not the most romantic thing anyone had ever said, she suspected, but it landed somewhere near her chest in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with being seen accurately by someone whose judgment she respected. "Tell me about him," she said. "He did. He talked about his father the way she talked about hers, not with the careful reverence people applied to the recently dead, but with the specific texture of someone they'd actually known, including the parts that were difficult. His father had been a demanding man, not unkind, but not easy. He'd built the ranch from 300 acres and had driven himself and everyone around him to build it to what it was, and the cost of that had been a particular kind of closeness that was not quite available. A man who was present, but always partly elsewhere, partly in the next problem, the next season, the next section of land. Claire used to say I got it from him, Caleb said, the not quite there quality. She said she'd be talking to me and I'd be listening, but my eyes were somewhere on the property. "Are you?" Rosalie said. "Like that?" He thought about it, which she'd noticed he did when other people would have deflected. "I used to be worse," he said. "After Clara died, I don't know how to describe it, more present in some ways. The thing that was always pulling part of my attention somewhere else went quiet, because the somewhere else stopped mattering the way it had." She was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like grief," she said. "It was," he said. "It also wasn't entirely. It was like, when you lose someone, the future you were living toward stops being the one you're in. And until you find a different future to be in, you're just in the present, which is a strange way to live, but it has a kind of clarity. You're still in it," she said. "The present." "Less than I was," he said, and he said it looking at the road ahead and not at her, which was the only way she believed it entirely. The county office was a brick building on the main street of the county seat, staffed by a clerk named Hennessy, who had the practiced caution of a man who'd learned that people brought documents to him in two states, settled and disputed. He read the situation as disputed immediately and handled it with the careful neutrality of someone who knew how to remain useful, regardless of outcome. Caleb laid the original surveys on the clerk's counter and explained the discrepancy. Rosalie laid her notebook beside them, open to the pages with her boundary measurements and the descriptions of the post-disturbances. Hennessy studied both for a long time, going back and forth between the original survey map and her notes, asking two precise questions about the methodology of her measurements and listening to her answers without the expression of a man humoring a woman, but of a man evaluating whether her evidence would hold. "You documented the soil disturbance at all 3 locations," he said. "Written descriptions immediately after observation," she said. "Same day. And the estimated time frame for the post-reset, based on weathering differential between wire and post-base soil," she said. 2 to 3 years. Not definitive, but consistent." He looked at Caleb. "You'll need a licensed surveyor to produce admissible measurements, but your original documents are clean and registered, and if the discrepancy your wife documented holds under survey, this moves from boundary dispute to deliberate encroachment." He paused. "That's a different legal matter." "When can the county send a surveyor?" Caleb said. "I can schedule one next week," Hennessy said. "Once a request is filed here, a counterfiling from the Aldridge side has to go through the same office, and I'll note the date of your filing. That protects your timeline." "File it today," Caleb said. Hennessy filed it that afternoon. Rosalie sat in the county office waiting room while Caleb completed the paperwork, and she thought about the 2 men who weren't ranch hands, and she thought about the newspaper piece, and she thought about the fire, and she thought about how all 3 of these things had the same quality. Pressure applied from multiple directions at once, the way you brought down something that was too solid to take head on. Aldridge had been patient. He'd been running his plan for 2 or 3 years at least, probably longer. He'd been careful and methodical, and he'd used the newspaper and the fire's aftermath and Rosalie herself as distractions, and he would have kept going in the same patient, methodical way until the Thornton East boundary had drifted far enough that recovering it would be a matter of expensive legal dispute over settled-looking ground. What he hadn't planned for, what Gerald hadn't considered and Caleb hadn't expected, and the town of Silver Creek hadn't imagined, was a woman who noticed drainage slopes from a wagon road and wrote down what she saw the same day she saw it. They were 2 hours out of the county seat on the way home when Hector, riding ahead, turned back and said there was a rider coming from the west who was moving fast for a man with no obvious emergency. The rider turned out to be Cord, on the fastest horse in the barn, which told her something before he even pulled up beside the wagon. Aldridge came to the ranch, Cord said. This afternoon. Came to the front door, not the boundary line. With those two men. What did he want? Caleb said. He asked for you, Cord said. I told him you were away. He said he'd wait. I said that wasn't something I could offer him without your permission. He said, Cord paused, and she could see him finding the words carefully. He said to tell you that the county boundary survey your wife apparently requested had been noted at his office as well, and that before you spent money on lawyers and surveyors, you might want to consider a private settlement that would be to everyone's benefit. The silence that followed had a specific quality, not surprise because neither of them was surprised, but the particular arrival of something that had been coming for a while. He has someone at the county office, Rosalie said. He has someone at the county office, Caleb agreed. He moves fast, Cord said. You filed this afternoon? 2 hours ago, Caleb said. Cord looked at her, then back at Caleb, and said nothing more, which was its own kind of statement about what kind of operation they were dealing with. Did he say anything else? Caleb said. He said the offer would be better received sooner than later, Cord said. And one of the men with him. He stopped. What? Caleb said. He looked at the south pasture damage for a while, Cord said. Then he said something to Aldridge I couldn't hear, but Aldridge smiled after he said it. It wasn't a friendly smile. Rosalie thought about the fire, the dry conditions, the way it had started in the South Valley and moved northwest exactly as the wind dictated, which was what fire did. It followed wind and fuel. She thought about the two men who weren't ranch hands and what the other kind of work might be. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at the road ahead, his jaw set in the way it set when he was holding something still while he thought it through. You think he said it, she said quietly. Not a question. I think I can't prove it, he said, just as quietly. Can you find out? He was quiet for a long time. The wagon rolled on, the late afternoon light going long and golden across the grass. There's a man in Billings, he said finally. Former county sheriff, now private. I've known him for years. He's careful and he's thorough, and he doesn't ask questions he doesn't want to answer. Then find him, she said. Caleb nodded once, and that was that. Aldridge came to the house on Sunday. He came alone this time. No two men, just himself, riding a good horse, dressed better than a working rancher needed to dress on a Sunday call, which was its own kind of statement. He knocked at the front door, and Martha opened it and came to find Caleb, and Caleb went to the door and Rosalie came with him. Aldridge was not what she'd constructed in her mind. She'd built him as a large man, physically imposing, the kind of presence that explained how he'd operated so long without pushback. He was actually moderate in every dimension. Medium height, medium build, a face that was pleasant in a careful way, the kind of face that was good at reflecting back whatever the person across from it wanted to see. His eyes were the tell, though. She'd met men with eyes like that before. Assessor's eyes, always adding things up, always placing value. He looked at her and she saw the assessment happen in about 2 seconds, the rapid cataloging of what she was, and she saw him decide she was less significant than he'd perhaps been worried about since the newspaper story had apparently not had the intended effect. She let him make that decision. She'd made her own. Caleb, he said, pleasant and easy, the voice of a man making a social call. Sorry to come unannounced. I was hoping we could talk about this surveying business before it gets complicated. Come in, Caleb said. They sat in the front room. Caleb in the chair he used for the room, Aldridge on the settee, Rosalie in the chair across from Aldridge. She said nothing and made no move to leave. Aldridge looked at her once and then treated her the way powerful men treated inconvenient women, which was by not looking at her again. I think there's been some confusion, Aldridge said. He had a way of framing things as confusion, which implied that he and Caleb were both reasonable men who could resolve confusion between themselves without the complication of county offices and surveyors. My fence line along the creek has been where it is for years. Your surveyor last fall found a discrepancy, but discrepancies in old surveys happen. I don't think we need to involve the county in a neighbor dispute. What would you propose instead? Caleb said. I've been looking at purchasing access to the creek boundary, Aldridge said. I made you an offer in the spring, which you declined, and I respected that. But given the fire damage to your south section, I imagine your operating costs are up this season. A fair price for a water access easement would help cover that, and we can put the surveying question to rest privately. What's your proposed price? Caleb said. Aldridge named a figure. It was not an unfair figure. That was the skill of it, the way it was calibrated to sound reasonable without being remotely proportional to what the water access was actually worth, or to what 6 feet of encroached boundary land represented over 30 years. The survey we've requested, Caleb said, will establish where the boundary line actually sits. I'd like to see those results before I discuss easements. Aldridge's pleasant expression did something very small, not changing exactly, but adjusting, the way a man's face adjusts when the conversation doesn't go the way he'd arranged for it to go. Surveys take time, he said, and they can get complicated when the original markers are ambiguous. I've seen boundary surveys run for 2 years in court. I'm sure you have, Caleb said. The offer I've made is straightforward and avoids all of that. He paused. I'm trying to be neighborly here, Caleb. It was the first time Rosalie spoke. Mr. Aldridge, she said, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided not to look at someone and has then been required to. The soil disturbance around your fence posts at the 3 locations I documented shows resetting within the last 2 to 3 years. The weathering differential between the wire and the post bases is distinct and measurable. A licensed surveyor will see the same thing I saw. She held his gaze. I filed written documentation of what I observed the same day I observed it. It's already part of the county record. The room was very quiet. Something moved through Aldridge's careful, pleasant face. Not anger. He was too controlled for visible anger. But something underneath the pleasantness that the pleasantness was no longer quite covering. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the fire damage from the boundary line. The way a man looks at a calculation. Mrs. Thornton, he said, the title deliberate. The implication being that she was being addressed at her appropriate level. I'm sure your observations were well-intentioned. They were accurate, she said. Well-intentioned and accurate aren't the same thing, but in this case they were both. Aldridge looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him. I think we're done here, he said. Aldridge rose. He hadn't gotten anything he'd come for, and he'd been told things he hadn't been told before. And the pleasant expression was back in place, but it was thinner now. A coat of paint on something that wasn't what the paint suggested. He said something polite about hoping they'd reconsider and walked to the door and let himself out. They heard the horse leave. Martha appeared from the hallway with coffee as though she'd been waiting with it, which she probably had. She set it on the table and left without a word. Caleb picked up a cup. He'll move faster now, he said. I know, she said. He needed to know what you had. Now he does. Was that wise? He said, and he asked it without criticism. Genuinely asking, the way 2 people asked each other things when they were thinking together. He already knew we had the original surveys, she said. His man at the county office told him that much. What he didn't know was what else we had. Now he knows we have documented evidence of the resets. She picked up her own cup. A man who thinks you might have something moves carefully. A man who knows exactly what you have has to decide whether to fight it or not. And you think he'll decide not to fight it? I think he has to weigh 6 feet of creek boundary against a documented case of deliberate encroachment that could bring county scrutiny to every boundary he's ever moved, she said. He's not the kind of man who risks everything for one piece of ground. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, you understood him in 20 minutes. I've met men like him before, she said. They're all built the same way. What they can't stand isn't losing. It's the calculation coming out wrong. He set down his cup and looked at her in the particular way he'd been looking at her more often lately, the way that was different from the assessment of the first week's because the first week's assessment had been completed and this was something else, something she hadn't named and wasn't sure she was ready to. Gerald called you big-hearted with limited practical experience, he said. Gerald was wrong, she said. On both counts, he said. She looked at him. He held it. On both counts, she agreed quietly, and neither of them said anything more about it, and the afternoon light came through the front room windows and lay across the floor in the long, unhurried way of a summer day that still had hours left in it, and the ranch was quiet outside, and somewhere in the distance a horse moved in the near pasture, and it was, without ceremony, enough. The county surveyor arrived on a Tuesday, which was becoming, Rosalie thought, her least favorite day of the week. He was a precise man named Garrett, thin and unhurried, who carried his equipment with the careful affection of someone who trusted instruments more than people and had reasonable grounds for that preference. He spent the first morning walking the east boundary alone before he'd let anyone accompany him, which she respected. A surveyor who wanted your input before he'd taken his own measurements was not a surveyor you could trust. She and Caleb waited at the house. Caleb read through contracts he'd been putting off. She went over the summer calf numbers with the broker Els, who had come out Tuesday morning and who was, as Caleb had said, honest. The specific kind of honest that involved telling you the market was down 3% from last month before you had the chance to discover it yourself, which was the only kind of honest that mattered in a business transaction. They sold 22 calves, not 20. Els had identified 2 more that would cost more to winter than they'd earn in spring, and he'd said so plainly, and she'd agreed, and Caleb had come in from the desk in the office and looked at the numbers and signed off without suggesting she'd done it wrong. That was its own kind of progress. Not the selling, but the not being questioned about it. Garrett came back to the house at noon and ate Martha's lunch with the systematic thoroughness of a man refueling, and then he spread his preliminary notes on the office desk and showed them what he'd found. It was worse than her measurements. Not wrong. Her 3 locations had been accurate within inches, but incomplete, because she'd ridden half the boundary and Garrett had walked all of it, and the resetting had happened in 5 locations, not 3. The total encroachment along the half-mile boundary averaged just under 5 feet, with one section running to 8. 8 feet, Caleb said. 8 feet 2 inches, Garrett said, without inflection. The post in that section was reset in disturbed soil consistent with work done approximately 2 to 3 years ago. The wire, by contrast, shows weathering consistent with 10 to 15 years of use. He looked at Rosalie. Your documentation of the differential is accurate. The methodology is sound. She nodded. What does this mean legally? Caleb said. My report will go to the county office as filed documentation, Garrett said. What happens after that depends on what you choose to pursue. The encroachment as measured constitutes grounds for a formal claim. The evidence of deliberate relocation. He paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who knew they'd be read carefully later. The evidence of deliberate relocation distinguishes this from ordinary boundary drift. That distinction matters to how a court would treat it. How long does a court process take? Caleb said. Could be months. Could be longer if the other party contests aggressively. Garrett began rolling his notes. But in my experience, when a survey report of this specificity is filed, the other party's calculation often changes before it reaches court. He left after lunch. Caleb walked him to his horse and stood there after he rode out, looking at the east boundary in the distance the way he'd looked at the burned south pasture. The look of a man accounting for damage to something he'd been responsible for. She came out and stood beside him. The afternoon was hot and still. The kind of July day that sat on top of everything and made the distance shimmer. He's going to fight it, Caleb said. Maybe, she said. Or he's going to realize that fighting a documented survey in a county where he already has a relationship with the county office is the kind of thing that invites scrutiny he doesn't want. She paused. He's been patient for 3 years. Patient men don't usually choose the expensive option when the cheaper one is available. The cheaper option being? Pulling back, she said, quietly. Resetting his fence to where it belongs and hoping the fire story stays loud enough that the encroachment story stays quiet. And if he doesn't? Then we go to court with Garrett's report and my documentation and the original land grant, and we win, she said. It takes longer and it costs more, and it's a miserable way to spend a year, but we win. Caleb looked at her. The afternoon light was doing the thing it did in July, making everything very clear and a little harsh. She could see the lines in his face that hadn't been there the first night she'd arrived, or maybe had been there and she hadn't known how to read them yet. She knew them now, the one near his eye that deepened when he was holding something still while he thought, the set of his jaw when he'd decided something and was waiting for the right moment to say it. I owe you an accounting, he said. You don't owe me anything, she said. I do, he said. Not a debt. An accounting. There's a difference. He looked back at the boundary line. When Gerald first wrote to me, 2 months before you arrived, I told myself I was doing a practical thing. A ranch this size benefits from a capable person in the house. Gerald said you were capable, in the limited way Gerald says things. I thought, a marriage of practical arrangement, clear terms, mutual benefit. I've done harder things. Caleb, let me finish, he said, not unkindly. I thought it would be like running a section of fence, something to manage, with clear outcomes. I didn't think... He stopped. I didn't think you'd be a person I'd actually have to reckon with. She was quiet. That's not a complaint, he said. I want to be precise about that. It's the opposite. He finally looked at her, directly, in the way he had when he wasn't managing what his face was doing. You walked into this house with 2 bags and your father's ledger books, and in 4 months you've changed how this ranch runs and how I think about how it runs, and... He stopped again, let out a slow breath. I don't want a marriage of practical arrangement. The afternoon sat around them, enormous and still. What do you want? She said. A real one, he said. If that's something you want too. I know I'm not an easy man. I know what I've been since Clara died. I'm not offering you easy. I didn't come here for easy, she said. I know, he said. That's part of it. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the kitchen table at midnight, his forearms flat on the surface, looking at nothing. She thought about the north fence line in the early morning. She thought about standing in the rain after the storm, and him saying, come inside, in the way that wasn't an order. She thought about Garrett's survey notes on the desk, and Elsa's honest accounting, and the 22 calves sold and the 5 boundary locations, and all the accumulated ordinary evidence of a life being lived alongside someone. I want a real one, she said. He nodded once. He didn't reach for her hand or make a speech about it. He just nodded, the way he decided things, and stood there for another moment looking at the boundary line, and then said, I'll have Martha put on supper, and went back inside. She stood there a moment longer by herself in the hot July afternoon, and let herself feel the full size of what had just happened, because she'd learned that you had to let yourself feel things at their actual size, or they got compressed into something smaller and harder and more difficult to carry. This was not small. She didn't want to carry it as though it were. Then she went inside too. The letter from Warren Aldridge arrived 10 days later, delivered by a hired writer who didn't wait for a response. It was written by a lawyer, which was itself an answer to the question of whether Aldridge would fight or pull back. A lawyer's letter was a middle position, more formal than a private visit, less committed than a court filing. The letter acknowledged a boundary discrepancy and proposed a negotiated settlement. Aldridge would reset his fence line to within 2 feet of the surveyed boundary, acknowledging the encroachment in 3 of the 5 locations while contesting the other 2. In exchange, Caleb would agree to a 10-year water access easement at a negotiated rate to be determined by a neutral party. Caleb read it twice and passed it to Rosalie without comment. She read it and saw exactly what it was. A man reducing his losses while preserving what he could. He was conceding the 3 locations most clearly documented, the ones where her notes and Garrett's survey were redundant and unambiguous. He was contesting the 2 where the evidence was strong but not quite as airtight. And he was trading the water access conversation back into the mix, because the water access was what he'd wanted from the beginning, and he was not going to leave entirely empty-handed if he could avoid it. He's giving up 4 feet to keep a conversation about the creek alive, she said. Yes, Caleb said. Do you want the easement conversation? He thought about it. I want the boundary settled first, he said. All 5 locations, not 3. Then write back and say the boundary settlement needs to be complete before any easement discussion begins, she said. And the rate for an easement, if you ever agree to one, will be set by the county assessor's office, not a neutral party of his choosing. You don't trust his choice of neutral party, Caleb said. I trust that any neutral party he proposes will have had breakfast with him at least once, she said. Caleb almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a full smile she'd seen from him. and it changed his face in a way she filed away as privately significant. The response letter went out that afternoon. Garrett was contacted about the 2 contested locations and provided supplemental documentation that addressed both of them with the kind of specific technical language that was difficult to argue with in court without bringing in a counter-surveyor, which would cost Aldridge money and time and would eventually reach the same conclusion because the evidence was the evidence. The final settlement came in August. Aldridge's fence was reset to the correct boundary at all 5 locations, confirmed by Garrett, witnessed by the county office, and by Cord and Denny, who Rosalie had asked to be present because she wanted men who'd seen the whole situation to see its conclusion. The water easement was not agreed to. Aldridge had pushed for it twice more through the lawyer, and Caleb had declined twice more, politely, and the 3rd time had not responded at all, which was its own kind of answer. On the day the fence was reset, Rosalie rode the east boundary from one end to the other. She did it alone, in the late afternoon, because it was something she wanted to do by herself, to ride the line that was now correctly placed and know exactly what that meant, what it had taken to get there, and what had almost been lost through the particular patience of a man who'd counted on no one paying close enough attention. She'd paid attention. That was, in the end, the whole of it. Gerald came in September. He came without writing ahead, which was characteristic, and arrived at noon on a Wednesday in a hired coach that was slightly too fine for the distance and the road, which was also characteristic. He came to the front door and Martha let him in and came to find Rosalie with the expression of someone delivering news they consider potentially volatile. She went to the front room. Gerald was standing near the window, looking out at the property with the expression of a man calculating what things were worth, which was the only way Gerald looked at anything. "Rosalie," he said. "Gerald," she said. He turned. He'd aged some in the months since she'd last seen him. Not dramatically, but the way men aged who were carrying things they didn't have the character to put down. His hair was grayer at the temples, and his jaw was heavier, and there was something in his eyes that might, in a more self-aware man, have been guilt. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He looked around the room. "Fine house," he said. "Yes," she said. There was a pause in which he waited for her to offer him hospitality, and she didn't, which she did deliberately and without apology. She thought about what she would do when Gerald came, because she'd known he would come eventually, once the story of Thornton Ranch and its owner's wife had filtered back to Billings through the channels these things traveled, and she'd decided she would be polite and honest and would not pretend that what he'd done had been done with her well-being in mind. "I heard about the fire," he said. "We managed it," she said. "And the boundary dispute with Aldridge." He paused. "That's being talked about in Billings. People say you handled it." "Caleb and I handled it," she said. Gerald nodded, looking at the window again. "You've done well here," he said, and the sentence had a quality she recognized, the quality of a man revising history slightly, trying to shape the record toward credit he hadn't earned. "You've done well here," as though here were something he'd given her as a gift, rather than something he'd disposed of her into without asking. "Gerald," she said, "say what you came to say." He looked at her. The guilt she'd thought she'd seen shifted into something more defensive, the way guilt did in men who weren't willing to sit with it. "I made the best decision I could with what I had," he said. "The debts were real. Thornton was a reasonable match. I wasn't wrong about that." "You weren't wrong that Caleb is a good man," she said. "You were wrong about everything else. You were wrong to make the decision without me. You were wrong to treat me like a problem to be managed. And you were wrong about what I was capable of." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Patricia said I should apologize," he said. "Patricia was right," she said. "But I notice you're telling me she said so rather than apologizing." He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd walked into a room expecting one kind of conversation and found himself in another. She'd changed in ways he could see, and probably in ways he couldn't, and she watched him trying to locate the Rosalie he'd sat across from at breakfast 11 months ago and not quite finding her. "I'm sorry," he said finally, flat and plain and without theater, which was the only way she would have believed it. She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She didn't tell him it was all right, because it wasn't entirely. And she didn't tell him she understood, because understanding something didn't make it right. But she also didn't need him to suffer for it. She'd discovered over the past year that she wasn't built for grudges. They required a kind of sustained attention that she'd rather spend on things that were actually growing. Caleb came in from the back of the house, having apparently been told by Martha that Gerald was here. He came in without rush, shook Gerald's hand with the specific cordiality of a man who had heard enough about someone to have an opinion and was keeping it to himself, and offered him lunch. Gerald stayed for lunch. He ate Martha's food and talked about Billings and about Patricia and about a horse he'd bought in the spring. And Caleb listened and asked the occasional practical question about horse breeding, and Rosalie watched the two men navigate each other and thought about all the ways a family was assembled, not by blood or arrangement, but by the daily choice to keep showing up for each other, and that some assemblies were made and some were found and some were both at once. Gerald left in the early afternoon. He hugged Rosalie at the door in the stiff way of a man for whom physical affection was a second language he'd never quite mastered, and she let him and said goodbye, and watched the hired coach disappear down the road, and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't been aware of holding. Autumn came the way it came to Montana, decisively and without sentimentality. The grass going first, and then the air, and then the quality of light, which narrowed from summer's extravagance to something more specific and clear. Rosalie found she loved it, the autumn more than the summer, which she hadn't expected. There was something in the way the cold clarified everything, stripped the landscape down to what was essential, that matched some quality in how she preferred to think. The ranch ran differently now than it had in May when she'd arrived with 2 bags and her father's ledger books. Not different in its fundamental nature. The cattle and the horses and the 42 hired men and the 12,000 acres were what they'd always been, but different in the way of an operation that had had its problems seen and addressed rather than accumulated. The drainage slope had been corrected in August, and the north field had dried properly for the first time in several seasons. The east trough had been fully replaced rather than patched again. 3 hay storage structures had been re-roofed before the first rain of September. Cord had stopped reporting to Caleb about things that came through Rosalie. He reported to whoever was the relevant authority, which had shifted, practically and without announcement, to sometimes being her. She didn't make a point of this. Making a point of things that had settled naturally tended to unsettle them. Denny had started bringing her problems before they became problems, which was the highest professional compliment she knew how to receive. Hector had, in the way of young men who found a person worth learning from, started asking her questions that had nothing to do with his immediate task. Questions about the market, about weather reading, about how you knew when an animal was going to be sick before it showed it. She answered them the way her father had answered hers, without talking down and without pretending things were simpler than they were. Martha, who had been the first person at Thornton Ranch to treat her like a person, had shifted from that into something closer to friendship, the specific frontier kind that didn't have many words in it, but had the quality of a thing you could rely on. She'd started leaving Rosalie's coffee on the desk in the office, rather than the kitchen table on the morning she was clearly working, which was a small and precise form of care. And Caleb was not easy, as he'd promised. He had the specific difficulty of a man who had built walls for good reasons, and was now in the process of discovering that he'd also built them around things he needed access to himself. He went quiet for days at a time in ways that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the ongoing work of grief, which didn't end on any particular schedule regardless of what else was happening in a person's life. She'd learned to sit near him during those times without requiring anything from them, and he'd learned to let her. And that was its own form of progress. He was also, and this she held carefully with the care of something new, funny. Not in the broad, obvious way of men who wanted you to know they were funny, but in the dry, specific way of someone who noticed the exact wrong detail in a situation and chose to say it. She'd been the first person to laugh at one of these observations, genuinely, not politely. And he'd looked at her with such brief, unguarded surprise that she'd understood it had been a long time since someone had laughed at the right moment. She'd started saving things to tell him. Small things, ridiculous things. The improbable fall of a fence post that somehow landed upright. A conversation with a traveling merchant that had gone in 17 wrong directions before arriving at a conclusion nobody wanted. She'd find herself in the middle of the day thinking, I'll tell Caleb that tonight. And the fact that she was doing it, the unconscious accumulation of shared material, was its own kind of answer to questions she hadn't finished asking. One evening in October, they were on the porch, their porch now, unambiguously, which it had become sometime between the fire and Aldridge's settlement without either of them marking the date. And she was reading, and he was not reading, which was what he did when he was thinking. And he said without preamble, I want to redo the north barn roof before the heavy snow. Before the end of October, she said, without looking up. The snow in this part of the county comes early in November, about 1 year in 3. I know, he said. I want to start Monday. Cord can lead it, she said. He's better with structure than Denny. Denny's better with animals. That's what I was thinking, he said. She turned a page. Then Monday, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Rosalie. She looked up. I need you to know. He stopped in the way he stopped when he was finding something precisely. I know this isn't what you would have chosen. If your father had lived and you'd had the ranch and your own life moving the direction you'd planned. I know this started as something that was done to you. Caleb, I'm not... He held up a hand just slightly, not a silencing gesture, but the gesture of a man who needed to finish his own sentence. I'm not apologizing for it. I can't apologize for a thing I had as little say in as you did. I'm just saying I know the difference between a life that was given to someone and a life they built. And I don't want you to think I don't know which one this has been. She set down her book. She'd thought back in May, sitting at Gerald's breakfast table with the contract in front of her, that the worst thing about what he'd done was the removal of choice. Not the ranch or the stranger or the unknown life. The removal of the ability to choose it. That was what had sat in her chest like a stone for the first weeks at Thornton Ranch, heavier than anything else. Not fear, not grief, the specific weight of a life not chosen. What she hadn't known then, because she hadn't known Caleb yet, and hadn't known what the ranch would ask of her, and hadn't known what she was capable of when something actually needed her to be capable, was that you could begin without choosing and still end up somewhere you'd have chosen if you'd been given the chance. Not always. She knew that. She wasn't naive about the particular violence of women's lives being decided by men who assumed the right to decide them. That happened, and it was wrong, and it left damage that outlasted the deciding. She wasn't arguing otherwise. She was saying something smaller and more specific, that this, here, had become hers, by her own work. By the creek drainage and the fence posts and the 3 animals at the east fence and Garrett's survey and Aldridge's letter and 22 calves sold to an honest broker and 1,000 small daily choices made in the direction of something worth keeping. I know the difference too, she said, and I want you to know that whatever this started as, it's mine now. Not because someone gave it to me, because I made it mine. He looked at her for a long moment. The October evening was cool around them. The first real cool of the season, and the sky to the west was doing the extravagant thing it did in autumn, purples and deep reds, the kind of sky that looked overdone until you'd seen enough Montana evenings to know it was just honest. I know, he said. I think I knew that before I knew what to do with it. You didn't do badly, she said, with what to do with it. You could have done worse than me, he said. Theoretically. Theoretically. She agreed, and he made the sound that was his version of a laugh. And she picked up her book again, and they sat in the cooling evening as the sky went from extravagant to quiet, and the ranch settled into the particular stillness of an October night coming in, and somewhere in the dark the cattle moved through the north pasture, where the grass had come back better than expected, and the horses were in the correct barn under a roof that would be redone by Monday, and the east boundary ran where it was supposed to run, marked by posts set into undisturbed ground. The last piece of the year came quietly, the way conclusions sometimes did when you'd been so busy with the middle of the story that the end arrived without announcement. In November, the Silver Creek Courier ran a piece about the Aldridge boundary settlement. It was factual and dry and gave more space to the survey methodology than to any of the people involved, which was perhaps appropriate. It mentioned Caleb Thornton and the original land grant documentation. It mentioned Rosalie Thornton and her field observation notes, describing them as the initial documentation of irregularities that prompted the formal survey request. The same newspaper that had run the piece in June about a woman from an indebted family involving herself in a wealthy man's affairs ran in November a factual account of that same woman's documentation contributing to the legal protection of 12,000 acres of frontier land. The newspaper man came to see her about it. He was young, younger than she'd expected, with ink-stained fingers and the particular earnestness of someone who still believed that accurate reporting was both possible and sufficient. He asked if she'd like to add anything to the account. She thought about it. "No," she said. "The account is accurate. That's enough." He seemed to want more, and she understood that. Accurate and sufficient was a less compelling story than the dramatic version with a heroine and a villain and a clear resolution. But she'd lived inside the dramatic version, and she knew it was inaccurate in the specific way of things that were shaped for effect rather than truth. The truth was grayer and more interesting. A woman who'd been sold like a parcel of land had turned out to know more about parcels of land than the man who'd sold her, and the rest had followed from that. That was, if you wanted a moral, the moral. Not that love conquered anything, or that goodness was rewarded, or that the right people always won. Just that paying attention mattered, that showing up with your eyes open and your notebook in your pocket and your father's ledger books in your bag mattered. That being underestimated, while genuinely unpleasant, had a specific and practical use if you let it. The newspaper man left. Caleb came in from outside and said, "What did he want?" "A better story than the true one," she said. "Did you give it to him?" "No," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went to the office for the afternoon accounts. She stood in the front room for a moment by herself and thought about her father, not about missing him, though she did, but about the specific things he'd left her. The ledger books, with their X-marked mistakes, the knife in her boot, the way of looking at a piece of land and reading what it needed. The things you couldn't leave anyone in a will because they had no monetary value, and every other kind. She thought about what she would have told him if she'd had the chance. That she'd found a place. Not the place she'd planned, not the future she'd been building toward in her own careful way before March had taken everything and Gerald had come with his papers and his settled expression. A different place, assembled from the debris of the first plan, made of harder materials and fitted together with the kind of care you could only apply when you had no choice but to care. She thought he would have approved of Caleb, not enthusiastically. Her father had been suspicious of wealthy men as a general category, and reasonably so, but specifically after consideration. He would have watched how Caleb listened and how he decided, and how he stood in the south pasture after the fire looking at the damage and not looking for someone to blame. And he would have said, in the understated way he had, "He'll do. He'll do." Standing in the front room of Thornton Ranch on a November morning, with the accounts waiting in the office, and the north barn roof crew starting work outside, and the winter coming in from the north the way Montana winter came, without apology or warning, she thought, yes, this will do. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. The south pasture grass wouldn't fully recover until spring. The relationship with the neighboring properties was functional but not warm, and probably never would be. Caleb still went quiet for days sometimes, and she still woke at midnight sometimes and went to the desk rather than back to sleep. And they were still two people learning how to be known by someone, which was harder than most tasks either of them had taken on. But it was real. Every morning and every problem and every decision made in the direction of something worth keeping. It was real, and it was hers, and she had made it so by the daily insistence of showing up for it, which was the only way anything was ever truly made. She was not the woman Silver Creek had expected. She was not the woman Gerald had described, or the newspaper had implied, or the town had decided before she'd unpacked her bags. She was not a heroine in the story someone else was writing about her. She was Rosalie Thornton, who got up before the hands and kept her notebook in her coat pocket, and had ridden back into a burning pasture for 3 animals because she'd said she was going to move the herd, and the herd was 3 animals short of moved. She was a woman who had come to a place she hadn't chosen and had chosen it anyway, every day, in every practical, specific, unglamorous way available to her, until it was indisputably hers. Outside, the North Barn crew was working. She could hear Cord directing and Hector asking a question and someone's hammer against new lumber, the sound of something being fixed before it needed to be, which was the kind of work she understood best and trusted most. She put on her coat. She went out to help.